Have you ever looked at someone who genuinely prefers being alone and wondered why solitude feels like home to them? Why silence energizes them more than conversations ever could? Why they retreat into their own world not out of loneliness, but out of comfort, almost as if being alone aligns them with something deeper inside themselves. Society rarely understands people like this because we're taught that connection is the measure of a healthy life. But some people carry a different kind of wiring, one that makes their inner world richer than anything outside of it. Their preference for solitude is not a flaw, not a wound, not a weakness, but a window into a psychological pattern far more complex than most people realize. To understand them, you must step into the quiet, into the places where their thoughts breathe more freely than their words ever could. People who prefer solitude often learned early in life that their inner world is more reliable than the external one. Some grew up in chaotic households where noise never stopped, where emotions clashed loudly, where expectations were heavy, or where personal space was rare. For them, solitude was not a luxury, it was oxygen. They learned early that being alone meant safety, calm, predictability, and control. Over time, their nervous system associated solitude with relief, and this early imprint follows them into adulthood. Someone who spent their childhood in an overwhelming environment does not crave external stimulation. They crave silence. They do not need constant interaction. They need freedom from emotional intensity. This preference does not come from avoiding others, but from preserving their inner balance. Their attachment to solitude is a sign of resilience, not fragility. For others, solitude emerges naturally from temperament. Some people are born with quieter nervous systems, deeper cognitive processing styles, and a preference for low stimulation environments. They think slowly, but thoroughly. They observe before they speak. They feel deeply, but privately. Their minds are wired to reflect, not react. While extroverted people recharge by connecting outward, introverted individuals, especially the deeply introverted, recharge by returning inward. Psychology calls this internal orientation, a cognitive style where the brain finds meaning not through external activity, but through inner thought. These individuals often love reading, writing, creating, imagining, analyzing, building, observing, and contemplating. Their solitude is not an escape from the world. It is the way they interface with it. Where others see silence, they see depth. Where others see emptiness, they see clarity. Where others see loneliness, they see presence. But the preference for solitude does not always come from temperament or upbringing. Sometimes it comes from self-knowledge. People who have lived long enough, made enough mistakes, or navigated enough turbulent relationships eventually learn something important. Peace is invaluable. Some discover that too many people drain them. Too many expectations suffocate them. Too many conversations exhaust them. Too much social noise blurs their sense of self. These individuals do not dislike people. They simply recognize when the emotional cost outweighs the emotional reward. They crave relationships that feel gentle, authentic, and meaningful, not relationships that feel demanding, performative, or chaotic. And because such relationships are rare, they default to solitude. Not because they cannot connect, but because they refuse to connect with anything that compromises their peace. There is also a psychological factor that rarely gets acknowledged. People who prefer to be alone often have a heightened awareness of their energy. They know exactly when they are drained, when they need to withdraw, and when their emotional capacity is reaching its limit. This self-awareness resembles an internal compass, one that guides them away from environments that overwhelm them. Social events with too much noise, too many people, or too much stimulation feel like emotional storms. Conversations that require masking, small talk, or forced enthusiasm feel heavy. Group dynamics where they must adapt constantly to others' moods or expectations drain them. For these individuals, solitude is not a rejection of others. It is a regulation of self, a way of returning to equilibrium, a way of protecting their nervous system from overload, a way of maintaining emotional clarity. However, Solitude also appeals to people who process the world differently. The deep thinkers, the emotionally intense, the creatively wired, the introspectively oriented. These individuals do not just experience life, they contemplate it. Their thoughts move slowly but with weight. Their emotions run quietly but with depth. They do not want fast conversations, loud environments, or constant stimulation because these things feel shallow compared to the richness of their internal world. Solitude gives them time to explore ideas, to reflect on life, to understand themselves, to notice subtle emotions that others overlook, to create mental space where creativity, insight, and intuition can flourish. For them, solitude is not the absence of connection, it is the presence of depth. People who prefer to be alone also tend to have a unique form of emotional independence. They do not rely heavily on others for validation, reassurance, entertainment, or identity. They know who they are without needing someone else to tell them. They trust their own judgment, even when it contradicts the crowd. They do not chase approval because external opinions do not define their worth. This emotional independence can be misinterpreted as coldness, detachment, or arrogance, but it is actually a form of psychological strength. People who prefer solitude do not isolate themselves from lack of confidence. They isolate themselves from overstimulation and unnecessary emotional clutter. They are not running from the world, they are choosing their world carefully. That said, solitude is not always rooted in strength. Sometimes it is rooted in wounds that taught someone to retreat inward because outward connections were painful. People who were betrayed, abandoned, manipulated, mocked, or misunderstood often learn to prefer the safety of their own company. It is not that they dislike others, it is that they no longer trust others easily. Their solitude becomes a shield, a defense mechanism, a place where disappointment cannot reach them. They keep people at a distance not because they crave loneliness, but because they fear being hurt again. Their desire for solitude is the echo of past relationships that left emotional bruises. And until healing happens, solitude feels safer than vulnerability. But here is the paradox. Whether solitude comes from strength or from wounds, the experience of being alone often brings clarity. A person who prefers to be alone becomes highly attuned to their own needs and boundaries. They learn what environments drain them. They learn what conversations feel empty. They learn what relationships feel unhealthy. They learn what their inner voice sounds like when the world goes quiet. And as their self-knowledge increases, their tolerance for anything inauthentic decreases. This selective approach to connection makes them appear distant when in reality they are simply refusing to dilute their peace for relationships that do not feel meaningful. People who enjoy solitude also tend to be highly self-contained, meaning they generate their own emotional stimulation. They can entertain themselves for hours without external input. They can sit in silence without discomfort. They can enjoy activities that others find boring. They can spend long stretches of time alone without feeling restless. This is because their inner world is active, rich, and engaging. They may daydream, analyze, imagine, create, or rediscover memories. They are rarely bored because solitude amplifies their creativity. It is in solitude that their ideas take shape, their emotions settle, their intuition awakens, and their identity strengthens. While others need external noise to feel alive, these individuals need internal quiet. Another reason people prefer to be alone is that solitude gives them control. Control of their environment, their time, their energy, their emotional exposure, and their boundaries. When they are alone, they decide what they want to do without negotiation. They decide how long an activity lasts. They decide how much mental or emotional effort to expend. They decide when to rest, when to think, when to create, and when to reflect. This autonomy is deeply satisfying for people with strong self-direction. It allows them to live on their own rhythm rather than adapting constantly to the rhythms of others. And when someone becomes accustomed to this autonomy, social interactions can feel intrusive. Not because they dislike others, but because they are no longer used to sharing control. Many people who prefer solitude also have a complex relationship with emotional expression. They may feel emotions deeply but express them subtly. They may prefer to process feelings internally rather than externally. They may struggle with overstimulation when conversations move too fast or emotions feel too intense. They may find emotional transparency difficult if they fear judgment or misunderstanding. Solitude gives them space to articulate their feelings before sharing them. It gives them time to untangle emotional knots. It gives them privacy to feel without the pressure of performance. And because emotional overwhelm feels uncomfortable, solitude becomes their natural emotional habitat. It is also important to understand that people who prefer solitude often value authenticity at a level that many people do not. They cannot tolerate superficial conversations, social games, forced politeness, or environments where masks are necessary. They do not care about trends, gossip, popularity, or groupthink. They crave rawness, conversations that matter, relationships that feel meaningful, silence that feels comforting rather than awkward. Because this type of authenticity is rare, solitude becomes the place where they can live honestly without compromise. They would rather be alone than pretend to be someone they are not. They would rather sit in silence than participate in conversations that drain them. They would rather wait for meaningful connection than settle for empty companionship. But solitude also attracts people who are emotionally observant, people who notice subtle details others miss. They read micro-expressions, shifts in tone, and underlying feelings. They sense tension even when no one acknowledges it. They detect emotional inconsistencies in hidden dynamics. This sensitivity makes social environments overwhelming because their brain processes everything simultaneously. They are not just listening to someone's words, they are analyzing the emotional context behind them. Solitude gives them a break from emotional overload. It allows them to reset their senses. It allows them to return to stillness. Another profound truth is that people who prefer to be alone often experience social fatigue easily. Socializing requires energy, emotional management, attention, memory, filtering stimuli, interpreting body language, and maintaining awareness. For some, this is effortless. For others, it is draining, even when they enjoy it. The cost is simply higher. After too much interaction, their mind feels exhausted, their emotions feel depleted, their senses feel overstimulated. And solitude becomes the recovery space, the emotional equivalent of sleep. Without alone time, they feel mentally and emotionally unbalanced. People who prefer solitude also tend to have a different relationship with time. They value slowness, presence, and depth. They do not rush from one activity to another. They do not multitask endlessly. They do not fill every moment with noise. They savor small things: a cup of tea, a quiet morning, a calm walk, a soft afternoon light. Social environments often move too quickly for them. Conversations jump from one topic to another. People interrupt each other. Stress rushes through the air. Expectations pile up. And they retreat, not because they reject connection, but because they reject speed. Solitude allows them to live life at a pace that feels human, thoughtful, intentional, slow, and real. Another layer behind the preference for solitude is that these individuals rarely fear being alone. They fear losing themselves. Many people have a deep instinct to merge with others, to fit in, to adjust, to adapt, to compromise, to become whatever the group needs. But people who prefer solitude resist this instinct. They do not want to lose their identity in the noise of collective pressure. They do not want to become a diluted version of themselves. They do not want to shape-shift emotionally for acceptance. Solitude protects their sense of self, allowing them to stay grounded in who they are rather than who others want them to be. At the same time, individuals who prefer to be alone often experience a different kind of loneliness. Not a loneliness caused by physical isolation, but a loneliness caused by emotional mismatch. They may feel surrounded by people, yet emotionally distant because they struggle to find others who understand them deeply. Their standards for connection are high, not because they are picky, but because they crave depth. They crave people who listen, who reflect, who understand silence, who communicate thoughtfully, who do not drain them. When such people are rare, solitude becomes preferable to shallow connection. It is also essential to acknowledge that solitude helps people regulate their identity. In a world filled with noise, social expectations, cultural standards, digital distractions, solitude gives people a chance to ask, "Who am I?" when no one is watching. People who prefer to be alone often have a strong inner identity that needs space to breathe. They value introspection, self-growth, and self-awareness. They use solitude to examine their choices, reflect on their emotions, and reshape themselves continuously. For them, being alone is not a pause from life, it is part of the journey. There is another deep psychological truth at play. People who prefer solitude tend to be introspective in ways that many others are not. They analyze life. They analyze themselves. They analyze their relationships, their patterns, their wounds, their hopes, their fears, their mistakes, and their desires. This introspection makes them more thoughtful, more grounded, and more aware. But it also makes them crave environments where reflection is possible. Noise disrupts their thinking. Constant interaction interrupts their inner dialogue. Solitude restores it. People who love being alone are also selective with their energy. They do not have endless emotional capacity, so they invest carefully. When they choose someone, they choose with intention. When they love someone, they love deeply. When they trust someone, they trust slowly but completely. They prefer a small circle of meaningful relationships rather than a wide circle of superficial ones. This selectiveness is not arrogance, it is intimacy. It is the desire for depth over breadth. Many people who prefer solitude also have heightened creativity. Their mind generates ideas naturally. Silence acts as fuel. Isolation acts as inspiration. They create because creation feels like conversation with the self. They write, draw, sing, imagine, build, conceptualize, design, and reflect because these activities emerge effortlessly from their inner world. For them, solitude is a creative catalyst. Another psychological factor is that solitude often provides emotional safety. People who have been judged, misunderstood, or criticized repeatedly learn to shrink their presence around others. They reduce emotional exposure. They speak less. They reveal less. They protect themselves. Solitude becomes a sanctuary where they can exist without judgment. They can feel without scrutiny. They can breathe without pressure. It is not that they fear people, they fear being misunderstood. It is also common for people who enjoy solitude to have high levels of empathy, but in a quiet way. They feel deeply, absorb emotions easily, sense tension immediately, and take on the emotional weight of others. Because of this sensitivity, social environments overwhelm them. They pick up too much, they notice too much, they feel too much, and solitude becomes emotional protection. Another misunderstood truth is that people who prefer solitude are often incredibly loyal. When they choose to let someone into their world, that person matters deeply. They do not form connections lightly. They do not commit casually. They do not share themselves easily. But when they do, it is genuine. Their loyalty comes from depth, not frequency. They may not show affection loudly or often, but their consistency is profound. In solitude, people also feel free from the pressure to perform. Social life often requires masks. Being polite, being agreeable, being energetic, being sociable, being on. But in solitude, they can remove the mask. They can let their mind wander. They can let their emotions settle. They can be raw and unedited. This emotional freedom is addictive. It makes solitude feel like home. Another reason solitude feels natural for some is that it reduces conflict. Social environments come with disagreements, misunderstandings, arguments, tension, and emotional negotiation. For people who prefer peace, avoiding unnecessary conflict is not cowardice, it is wisdom. Solitude offers simplicity. It eliminates friction. It removes emotional noise. It is also essential to note that people who prefer solitude often have strong internal boundaries. They do not tolerate disrespect, they do not tolerate manipulation, they do not tolerate inconsistency, they do not tolerate drama, they do not tolerate emotional instability that threatens their peace. Their solitude is not isolation, it is filtering. For these individuals, solitude is a way of protecting time. Time to think, time to grow, time to recover, time to create, time to reflect. They view time as precious. They do not waste it on superficial connections or meaningless obligations. Solitude becomes a way of living intentionally. Yet, people who prefer solitude still need connection, just not constant connection. They need relationships that feel calm, authentic, considerate, and emotionally grounded. They crave people who understand silence, who do not demand constant interaction, who respect boundaries, and who allow space. When connections like this exist, solitary people flourish. To understand the psychology of those who prefer solitude is to understand the complexity of human needs. Some need noise, others need quiet, some need crowds, others need stillness. Some feel alive in groups, others feel alive in their own thoughts. Neither is superior, neither is deficient. They are simply different expressions of human nature. People who prefer to be alone move through life with an inner compass that points toward peace, authenticity, depth, and self-connection. They are not running from the world. They are returning to themselves. Their solitude is not emptiness. It is fullness. It is not the absence of connection. It is the presence of clarity. It is not loneliness. It is alignment. And in the end, solitude is not a retreat. It is a home within oneself, a home that cannot be taken away, a home that grows deeper with time. People who prefer to be alone are not missing something. They are simply listening to a frequency the world often drowns out. They are listening to themselves.